Now, for all the money we spend on propping up the ABC, they couldn't even bother to quote the correct editor. But enough of the incompetence of Media Watch. In your view, is mass migration making life harder for young Australians, not just in rents? Because obviously if you bring in people, you don't build houses, clearly you're going to have a rental problem. But how does that affect wage growth and even the social cohesion of our cities?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and absolutely one that isn't asked nearly enough. There was a poll recently, I think last year, that showed that Sydney is one of the worst places in the world to make friends. Now, I think this does come down to, unfortunately, the fact that nearly 50% of Sydney is foreign-born. Now, that's not to sort of insult anybody who is foreign-born, but if you rapidly bring in large numbers of people into a Sydney, it does make it harder to create a community. It rapidly changes, and especially with numbers like we've seen, it makes it very, very hard to sort of build communities, build friendship groups and things like that. Look, lots of studies have been done about how it does affect social cohesion as well. And look, wages, I think it's pretty well through wage competition alone. You bring in a huge number of people who are competing for, often entry-level jobs like young people are. Your wage in wage competition is going to get smashed. And so young people are getting pincered, essentially. Their social cohesion gets smashed, their wages get smashed, their rentals get smashed. Young people really need to have a voice in this debate. And unfortunately, they haven't had one, and I can see why they're not raising their voice about it. But I think things are so bad that now it's time to talk about it.
Well, you quote some statistics on your website, Migration Watch Australia, which viewers may find interesting. You say there were 784,000 migrant arrivals in 2023. 7.7 million people in Australia were born overseas. Rents have gone up by around 45%, and it takes over 12 years to save the average deposit for a house. Now, in your open letter published in The Spectator Australia by me, you add that over 70% of Australians want lower migration, including Labor voters. Jordan, where is this social mandate for mass migration coming from? Because as far as I can tell, nobody asked for it. When they are asked, they say, no, we don't want it. So why is it being pursued?
Well, I have a sneaking suspicion that, look, if we want to know why people want immigration, you just need to listen to who's asking for it. A lot of who is asking for it seems to be big businesses. They are constantly calling out for mass migration. I am assuming to have workers and consumers. Furthermore, left sides of the Labor Party, the Greens and other sort of groups like that, the cultural left are looking and calling for immigration, I'm assuming, so they can try and get more votes for their party. But this is just completely contrary to what mainstream Australians want. Like you say, 70% of Australians want reduced immigration. 53% of Labor voters want reduced immigration. So we're now entering a period of Australia's history where it's becoming the cultural left and the elites ganging up against mainstream average Australians. And I think it's now time that we start making a cohesive, solid, professional debate around migration, and that's what I'm trying to do, to be honest.
Yes, well, a lot of people suspect that perhaps balancing some of the budget spreadsheets might have something to do why governments like mass migration, because it's not only the Labor government that brings in mass migration, it was also happening under the Liberal government. And they're not importing people for votes, they're just doing it. Why? That is the question that people were asking the Morrison government when they were in power. But you did raise an interesting point about slow migration, because we've had skilled migration, fully funded skilled migration in Australia for a long time, and it's been successful. Nobody was against moderate skilled migration. Migrants came here, they married Australians, their children were Australian, and their families continued to have a spiritual connection to Australia, even back to the pioneers for their children. So our story of Australia was one story. But if you bring in too many people too fast, it was harder for them to connect with the country as a whole. They tend to connect with their home countries where they came from, which is why we see so many foreign flags flying in the street instead of Australian flags. But there was something announced in the budget which I presume is designed to handle this massive backlash to mass migration. That was university places and limiting them for foreign students. What are your thoughts on that as a solution?
Look, I welcome any action on lowering numbers of immigration into Australia. My problem is that it doesn't go far enough. Labor's soft cap on international students in Australia is actually they're capping growth. So essentially what they're saying is we're still going to bring more in, we're just going to bring less than before. Well, the fact of the matter is that nearly 1 in 37 Australians, people in Australia right now, is an international student. We have around 700,000 international students in the country right now. This is a huge number. In America, it's something like 1 in 330 or something like that, right? So Australia, the amount of foreign students in Australia is absolutely massive. I'm glad Labor's sort of talking about cutting it down. I think, it won't be enough to actually solve the housing crisis. We need to really look at changing the foreign student system. I think looking at offshore models rather than onshore models is a really good way of easing pressure on the housing crisis. The truth of the matter is that we should not be bringing in more people at a time when Australians are going homeless. I think it's really time to start putting Australians first, and we can sort of figure out immigration later, to be honest.
Well, I mean, that's if even Labor carries through with it, because the universities are screaming. So more than likely, Albanese will just kind of announce it and that will be the end of the story. But if it does go ahead, maybe our kids will have more chance. Maybe there'll be a little bit more real estate available for rent in the cities. But as you say, it's probably not enough.